All right. Good morning, algebra students. We are working on lesson 4-6, absolute value equations and inequalities. Yesterday we talked all about just equations, so now we're going to move on to the inequalities part. Now, if you remember me saying before, this section is tough, very, very tough. So definitely tune in, pay attention, make sure you follow the rules, and hopefully we will be all set. Remember, you can always stop the video to try out problems or stop the video and rewind to replay. All right, so let's talk about inequalities. So I'm going to write inequalities, really capital letter here, so it sticks out. So the first part was equations and now inequalities. So we have a definition in mathematical language, and I like to give those to you so you get better at reading them because that is going to be part of it. Eventually you'll have some classes where you need to be able to just read them and understand them yourself. So, all right, so solving absolute value inequalities says to solve an inequality in the form absolute value of A, whoops, get rid of that, let's try that again, I wrote that wrong, absolute value of A, which is greater than B, where A is a variable expression, and B is greater than 0, solve A is greater than B, or A is less than negative B. So a couple things I want to point out. First of all, this is for a greater than. So greater than is going to make a difference. So make sure you understand that it's for greater than. And as long as B is greater than 0, which all of these B are going to be greater than 0 for what we're going to do, you have to split it up. Notice the first time is you set it up and you just drop the absolute value signs and everything's exactly the same. The second time you set it up, notice they flipped the inequality sign and they made B negative. Okay, so that's going to be very, very important. So I'm going to write those out so you can kind of see. If the absolute value is greater than you set it up as an OR. Okay, so you set it up as an OR. So if it's greater than, it gets set up as an OR. And I like to refer this as a greater than or gore. Blood, guts, and gore. It's around Halloween, so that's perfect. All right, so in order to do that, you're going to set it up as an OR, so it gets set up as an OR. So the first one is you drop the absolute value sign. And keep everything else the same. The second time, or the second one you set up, you drop the absolute value sign. You flip the inequality sign. And you change B, whoops, change the B to a negative. Okay, so those are the two things, the two different ways to set it up. So let's try a problem and let's see what I'm referring to. So here we go. Number 1, absolute value of x plus 3 is greater than 4. Okay, so notice this is a greater than. So immediately, because it's a greater than, it becomes an OR. So greater than, becomes an OR. and you can remember it by GOR, greater than or. Okay, so immediately I split it into 2. When it's an absolute value, it's got to be an absolute value, and it's got to be greater than, which that's what we have. So we split it up into 2. First sign is just this part right here. Drop the absolute value sign. So I just write x plus 3 is greater than 4. That's it. The second time, this is the directions we follow. Drop the absolute value sign. So you're going to have x plus 3. You flip the inequality. It was greater than, so now you're going to make it less than. And when you flip the inequality, you have to change b to a negative and make that negative 4. Okay? So once you get it set up, then you solve just like normal. So I'm going to subtract 3 from both sides, and I have x is greater than 1. Over here, I subtract 3 from both sides, and I have x is less than negative 7. So if I were to draw this, and I'm not going to worry about drawing every single one because I think you're good with that, but notice that the signs are opposite, and that's what happens with an OR. I go from negative 7 up to 1, so I'm going to count by 2s, negative 8, negative 6, negative 4, negative 2, 0, and 2. I would have an open circle at negative 7, and they said x is less than that, so I know my line is going to go this direction. Okay, and then an open circle at 1, and it says 1 is greater than, so it's going to go this direction. Okay, so that's what we have. Whenever it's a greater than, you set it up as an OR. Let's try another one. I'll leave those notes there so we can kind of refer to them again. Number 2, so absolute value of n plus 8 is greater than or equal to 3. So again, this is a greater than sign. So that means I'm going to set it up as an OR. So it's greater than. So that means I'm going to set it up as an OR, and I remember it as greater than or. Blood, guts, and gore. Gore. Okay? So in order to set it up into 2, first rule, so this is kind of like our number 1 setup. Our number 1 setup is just to drop the absolute value signs. So n plus 8 is greater than or equal to 3. That's all I do. Then the number 2 setup. The number 2 way to set it up is you drop the absolute value sign. So I'd have n plus 8. I would have to flip the inequality. So now I'm going to have less than or equal to, and I take b and I change it to a negative 3. Okay, so that's the second setup. And now we solve just like normal. So I subtract 8 and I subtract 8. So that would be n is greater than or equal to negative 5. Over here, I subtract 8 and I subtract 8. And n is less than or equal to negative 11. And notice when I'm doing these, it isn't like before. Sometimes we saw that 4 and negative 4 with the equations. Not that way, okay? So let's kind of take it up a notch. Those are 2 basic ones. So what if we have the absolute value of n minus 3 is greater than 7? Now, for this one, notice this guy here, you're going to isolate first. Just like we did yesterday with the equations, we have to do the same thing here. We have to isolate first. So I'm going to do that before I do anything else. I'm going to add 3 and I'm going to add 3 to isolate the absolute value. So n is greater than 10. Now, once I do that, I look and see what kind of sign I have. And again, I have a GOR, greater than or. So I set it up into 2. First time, so my number 1 is to just drop the absolute value signs and keep everything the same. Drop the absolute value signs and keep everything the same. Next time, step 1, so this is my number 2 setup. I drop the absolute value signs. I change the inequality from a greater than to a less than, and I change 10 to a negative 10, and I take the opposite. And of course, it's an OR, so they have opposite signs. Okay, so then let's look at number 4. Number 4. So number 4 would be 4, absolute value of k plus 5 is greater than 8. So once again, I need to isolate first. That absolute value has to be all by itself before I can do anything with it. So to isolate first, I'm going to divide by 4 on both sides. So that leaves me with the absolute value of k plus 5, which is greater than 8 divided by 4, which is 2. So now, again, it's isolated. It's an greater than, which means it's going to be a GOR. So I'm going to split it into 2. And those two, number 1 and then number 2. So the first setup is just drop the absolute value signs and keep everything the same. The second one is drop the absolute value signs, flip the inequality, and make B negative. And when it says B negative, I'm referring to right up here. Notice it says B. So it says the absolute value of A is greater than B. So that's what B I'm referring to. Okay, now we solve. So subtract 5, and that gives us K is greater than negative 3. Over on the other side, subtract 5, and K is less than negative 7. So there's my two answers. Okay. All right, one last one, number 5. So I have 9 is less than the absolute value of C plus 7. Now, if you notice, I flip-flop these, okay? And so in order to do these, I'm just going to tell you to always have the absolute value sign on the left. So right here, before we get started, I need the absolute value sign. And I'm going to put it must be, all in big letters, on the left. And right now it's not on the left, it's on the right. So I'm going to have to flip this whole equation. So I'm going to flip the sides, but I'm not going to change any inequality. It's still like eating the absolute value. That's the bigger side. So I'm going to do C plus 7 is greater than 9. And now you can see when I flip it, I have a GOR. I have a greater than that I'm going to split into an OR. So I'm going to split it into 2. So my number 1 and my number 2 is drop the absolute value signs, copy everything the same. Second one, drop the absolute value signs, make it a less than, and change B to negative. So you follow that pattern every single time. So subtract 7 from both sides. So C is greater than 2. Subtract 7 from both sides, and you have C is less than negative 16. And there you have it. So a couple of things to remember. If it's a greater than, it gets set up into an OR. There are 2 ways to do that. Number 1, just drop the absolute value signs. Number 2, drop the absolute value sign, flip the inequality, change B to negative. Another thing you need to remember is to isolate first. So as you did this one, number 3, we had to isolate first. Number 4, we needed to isolate first. And then number 5, how I changed it up, is the absolute value sign must be on the left. So you always have to flip it in order for you to solve that one. So that's your must, your first thing that you need to do. Okay, that's it. Have a great day.